Dicko's dropped a big clue there as to why I've got the cat look. Someone's going to come on in a minute and tell me it's not a cat, it's something else. And I've got it wrong because I did. The ears are a bit weird. Maybe I'm not a cat. Am I a dog? Bunny type? No. Definitely looks like a cat to me. Anyway, simile. There is indeed a simile in Storm on the Island, and we will get to that really shortly. So feel free to hit me up. I must say, sometimes the comments and the questions come through. Yes, Tyler, on a bit of a delay. So it's not that I'm ignoring you. Feel free to ask a question again. Little ear twitch there. If you feel that it's not being answered. So first things first, we've got extract from the Prelude and Storm on the Island. Now, as we know, we're not able to predict questions, but we've had a war poem the year before last. We had a power poem, Ozymandias, last year. We might well get a nature poem, the power of nature. So starting with the extract from the Prelude. It's a good starting point. So it's a poem that deals with the power of nature. You could even argue that it deals with kind of our sexual nature and a sexual awakening in him as a teenage boy. We can come back to that point maybe, but the question will likely be the power of nature if that's your named poem. So starting with that, the context here is really important. The man from AQA who ran a session that I was in a while ago had commented that more and more kids, and this was music to my ears, to my cat ears, more and more students are going in and they're writing about these poems as though, Tyler, as though they've never seen them before. So it's showing your understanding. The most important thing you'll take from this is your understanding of the poet and what they're trying to achieve. So the bulk of your marks is going to come from those methods. What language is used, what kind of structural features are used, how does that poet get their message across? So in terms of extract from the Prelude, it's so important that you understand a little bit about Wordsworth there. It's important also that you understand that this poem that you're studying is an extract. It's an extract from a much longer poem, and this particular extract deals with his sort of almost early teenage years. Now, Tyler, you're quite right. Perhaps it's this idea of solitude, that nature's his only friend, or certainly he takes comfort in nature. So Wordsworth grew up in the Lake District. If anyone's been there or heard of it, it's an area of immense natural beauty, and we see that at the beginning of the poem. So I always kind of say this: look at the beginning, look at the end, look for kind of a shift in tone, a volta, a change in tone, a change in mood. And that change in tone and mood, it happens really, really early on. So we open with this idea of, one summer evening. It's a scene of beauty, everything's quite relaxed. One summer evening, and he's just by the lakes in the Lake District, led by her, and he comes across this boat and he decides to take the boat and go rowing across the lake in this area of natural beauty. We've got the image of the moonlight sparkling, okay? It's glittering. It's a place of natural beauty and it's lovely. But soon enough, there is that shift, there's that change, and the mood changes, and we go from sparkling, glittering moonlight to actually a darkness, a huge peak, the peak of a mountain, black and huge and overbearing. Led by her, there's definitely a similarity there, Tyler, with the brackets. Led by her, it's just an extra bit of information. In terms of comparing those two poems, Prelude I would stick to as a nature poem. The power of nature, and My Lost Duchess, more to do with the power of people, or powerful people, people dominating and asserting their power. So in terms of comparisons, really, we're looking at extract from the Prelude. It goes really nicely with Storm on the Island. You could link it to Exposure, and we're going to look at Exposure tomorrow. Okay, so I hope that clears that up. I wouldn't compare those two. Yeah, perfect. So there's definitely that kind of change in mood and that change in tone. Now, on a surface level, the simplest interpretation of that is the fact that, man stole a boat, essentially. I found it. I found a boat. You don't walk down Dartford High Street, find a bike and take it. Stealing. So he's stolen a boat. He's decided to take it. So the simple answer for that is that actually nature is reflecting his conscience back at him. The idea he's done something bad. If you've read of Mice and Men, it's like, I did a bad thing. You know, he's done a bad thing, and maybe nature's reflecting that back at him. Now, on a deeper level, here's where I hope that you've got your pen and your pad ready, and I hope people are going to watch this back and, you know, make some notes on that. As a young child, when he was 7, his mum died. 7 years old. I thought it was 8 initially. Not important, the detail of that. So his mum died at a young age, and by age 13 he was completely orphaned. He had no parents. Later in life, his brother died in a shipwreck. You know, you're not going to go off on one about the life and times of Wordsworth, but you can mention that actually his relationship with nature was potentially quite dark, and perhaps this poem reflects that. You know, examiners love all that. He edited this poem for 50 years of his life. So later in life, Abe, good evening. Later in life, he would have come back. He definitely did come back, and he edited and he reviewed and he worked the poem through. So we could definitely say that mum dying at 8, dad dying at age 13. You know, age 13, he's got no parents around him. His brother died later in life in a shipwreck. And out of his 5 children, him and his wife had 5 children, 3 of those children died before their parents did. If you just think about that for a moment, it's the idea that as beautiful as nature is, as comforting and relaxing and scenic as nature is and was where he grew up, nature also has a darkness. And it's this idea that nature can take things from you. Nature can turn on you at any moment. So absolutely, a bit of comment from Glovebox there. No one to guide him through his teenage years. And I think that's where, you know, people kind of interpret this perhaps in a sexual way. You know, I'd always start with the obvious, and you can maybe build up to perhaps, maybe, possibly. Maybe it's this idea of a kind of sexual awakening. There's lots of language to do with peaks there, a huge peak. You know, the upreared, its monstrous head. It's the idea of maybe those sexual feelings taking on a mind of their own, a spirit of their own, and it's kind of monstrous to him maybe because he has no one to guide him through and no one to talk to about that. So some scholars believe that this you know, this night by the lake was an interaction with a prostitute. You've got the brackets that Tyler picked up there, the led by her, the idea that he's being, you know, led along and it's his first sexual experience. And you've got kind of, you know, the image of him in the boat. I struck and struck again. Make of that what you will. But, you know, on the surface level, him rowing this boat across the lake, it's panic. He's scared. So it's potentially quite a complex poem, but start with the obvious. He's stolen a boat, the huge peak of the mountain, the darkness, the blackness. It's almost like maybe he feels nature's turning on him because he's done something wrong. It's the second layer. It's like an onion, I guess, the next layer of the onion. The idea that his parents were taken from him, his own children, 3 of the 5 of them died before him, that his relationship with nature is complicated. And it's this idea, this concept. And that's a grade 9 skill. You know, you go in with a concept. Wordsworth, in this poem, presents us with the idea that nature can take things from you, that nature can turn or change at any moment. And the volta, the change in mood there, from the sparkly, glittering, idle moonlight to the darkness of the mountain, that shift. And that's a structural thing for you to comment on. That shift happens quite early on, and the rest of the poem is filled with that panic. I struck and struck again, that darkness, and it ends with this idea that after that night it was a trouble to his dreams. So there are so many different interpretations, and as long as you're sticking to that tentative language, and really maybe even just watching this back and really working your way through, making some notes, Wordsworth presents us with this idea. So I'm just having a little quick look. So yeah, the trembling oars that David's picked up there, that kind of fear. Is it a fear of the fact that he's realised how insignificant he is, the insignificance of man, of humankind, when looking against the immense power of nature and power of the natural world and the power to take family members from you, and there's nothing that you can do. So it's a scary thing if we if we think about it, definitely. It's a great idea for you to have a little read of these poems before the lives, have a look while we're talking, definitely reflect a little bit afterwards. So, you know, in a nutshell with that one, that do not move like living men. Absolutely, that's a nice quote there, Tyler. You know, what do you make of that? The idea that these shapes that nature creates, they're not human, they don't move like living men. That's an excellent quotation from you there, because it's this idea that nature isn't like us. It's not human. Perhaps you can reason with a human, but you can't reason with nature. What thought is that? The unpredictability of nature. No guidance, didn't know how to live, so nature can't move like a living man. That's a nice way to go about that as well, Tyler. So really, really nice. So yeah, absolutely. So you've got Murta there, the idea that, you know, nature, it's awe-inspiring. You know, we can be in awe of it. We can wonder at it and say how beautiful it is, but actually it can turn at any moment. It cannot be controlled. Absolutely. We touched upon that a little bit with tissue yesterday, and I think really if you can go in with an argument, go in with a line of argument, a concept, an idea, yeah, Wordsworth presents us with the idea that nature can't be controlled and it can turn. It can turn at any moment, and the shift from the sparkling, bright, glittering moonlight to the darkness, the black peak, black and huge, you know, the huge peak of the mountain, and the fear that that evokes within him. And essentially, you know, homeward he went. He ran home because that fear kicked in. And in much the same way, and this is exactly how you can write it in the exam, in much the same way, Heaney also presents us with the idea that nature can turn at any moment, and that's how we can then go across to Storm on the Island. And I'm still waiting for someone to tell me why I'm sporting the cat look, other than the obvious that it looks good or not. He does find safety in nature at the end as he returns to the willow tree. Absolutely, he returns to, I think he calls it the covert, kind of wants to hide away again, the covert of the willow tree. What a beautiful thing to say, actually, because it's almost as though he's feeling his way through life. If we can take the kind of the bank, the area of land, the shore of the lake as kind of his comfort zone, and maybe him rowing that boat out into the lake is a metaphor for him sort of sailing off into the adult world, and actually it's terrifying. It's a source of panic. I struck and struck again. There's no adult there to guide him. There's just the darkness and the fear. And then he goes back, as Miss Dickinson just said there, he goes back to the covert of the willow tree. Now, if you speak to Bradley about that, he'll tell you that perhaps that covert is him again hiding his sexuality away, that he's had his first sexual experience. And he then goes back to kind of hiding it away again. So again, you start with the obvious, you show a clear understanding, and then you can drop the tentative language in, perhaps, could be, and might be. So woo woo, I'm glad we've got the simile, the cat reference. So in terms of the prelude, that nature can change at any moment, Heaney also gives that idea. Brilliant. So we've got this beautiful simile that actually, you know, the ocean, the spray of the ocean, it hits the windows. What an image there. You know, it's the power of nature. We're at home now. And again, Heaney presents us with the image of being home. He's not gone somewhere else to a foreign land. He's not gone to a lake. He's not gone to the trenches like Wilfred Owen. He's at home. He's at home with a nice cup of tea. And it's this idea that in his safe place, they have to be prepared for the power of nature. So it opens with, we are prepared. You know, we build our houses squat. We do everything we can to prepare, but it's still quite a scary thing. So the spray of the ocean hits the windows, and they're behind the windows watching, and it spits like a tame cat turned savage. It's a shame my cat's out, because I would have showed him to you. He's a tame cat. He likes to be stroked, he likes a cuddle, he purrs, he's tame. But a tame cat turned savage. And that's what home is for Heaney. So remember, he lives in Ireland. It's the idea, it's by the Atlantic Ocean, on the coast. It's this idea of that tame cat, indeed, is that metaphor possibly for home, that it's tame, it's calm, it's safe, it's beautiful. But just like in the Prelude with the light and the dark, it can turn at any moment. And you've got the juxtaposition there of the tame and the savage. So remember, it's all about those methods. How does Heaney show us that? Well, he shows us through the simile, like a tame cat turned savage, and the juxtaposing words of tame and savage show the volatility that nature can turn at any moment. Even the trees know not to grow there. What a lovely comment from Dicko there. So there are no trees. There's no natural shelter. They're exposed. Even the trees have got the sense, that they're not going to survive there. But as humans, we're trying to maybe outdo nature by building our homes there, building them squat. But we're still scared at the end of it. It's a huge nothing. Another oxymoron there. It's a huge, huge nothing that we fear. It's nothing really. It comes and it goes, but it's still pretty scary. Lovely. Well, I think we're all enjoying this Friday night, a wild Friday night. We're all here discussing Heaney. Love it. Humans think they can outsmart nature. Absolutely. It's the idea we build our houses, we do everything we can, but ultimately nature kind of wins, or if it doesn't win, it certainly scares us for a short amount of time. So something to think about there, the tame, the savage, absolutely. So Prelude and Storm on the Island, they really do go beautifully. I'm trying to keep up with comments here. If I've ignored you, I'm really sorry. Feel free to ask me again. So yeah, space is a salvo. Again, you've got that kind of that juxtaposition again. This poem's full of oxymorons, full of contrasting images. Space, my hands are going through space now. Space is everywhere. A salvo is an explosion. Space is a salvo. We're bombarded by the empty air. Well, how can something empty bombard you? So the whole thing is a contrast, and I think the contrasting images really reflect that idea of 1 minute it's calm, but it can turn. And that contrast can be a daily reality when you're looking at, that's a beautiful word there from Abe, the volatility. Home for Heaney is a volatile place. It can turn at any minute because of these storms that kick in. So we'll definitely have a look at exposure tomorrow, and we can look, because really when we look at that, it's kind of two different poems in one. It's one's to do with the kind of effects of war, but there's also a kind of nature slant on that as well. James Cunningham in the house. So yeah, I hope that's kind of helpful there. So Dicko's made a link there between space being a salvo, the air being explosive, and the wind, which essentially is air, it's moving air, in Wilfred Owen's Exposure, kniving. So in both poems, yeah, you've got the air, which we breathe. It's a kind of oxymoron in itself, isn't it? That air keeps us alive and we breathe it, but it can turn against us also, or it can certainly feel that way. If you look at a hurricane or really strong winds, the air we breathe, it goes inside us, but actually it can be really powerful and actually pretty damn scary. So the semantic field of war and conflict, definitely. So I think Kai in my class picked up on that Heaney uses lots of kind of war imagery in the way that he's describing nature. He talks about being bombarded by the empty air. He talks about it pummels your house. If you pummel something, you hit it really hard. So it is almost like a metaphorical war, man versus nature. It's that whole idea, and it links back to Wordsworth feeling that as much as nature's beautiful and company for him, it also can feel like an enemy when it's taking people from you, like your parents, your sibling, your own children. So that's a really nice point to compare. Tyler, this wizened earth has never troubled us. Could you say they fear the worst is yet to come? That's interesting. So the earth has never he actually says the earth has never troubled us with hay. I think that's the reference. I'm sort of doing this from my mind. Correct me if I'm wrong. The earth has never troubled us with hay. If you imagine, like, hay is dried grass horses eat. What's hay? It's what horses eat. it's dried grass, isn't it? So if the wind blows, hay can blow really far away. So he's saying, well, actually, we don't have hay here. As much as they don't have trees, they don't have hay, because if they did, it would be trouble, because the storms that come would blow it all away. So it's the idea that the earth has never troubled them with hay, because they would lose it if it did. The storm could be a metaphor for all of the problems. Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, Abe. It's funny because I was at a meeting a while back with a lady, a teacher as well, and she's from Belfast, and I was talking to her about it, and I said this to my year 10s earlier. Whenever I speak to an Irish person about this poem, from my experience, I'm not saying all Irish people, that would be a gross generalisation, but any Irish person I've spoken to about it recently has sort of almost, rolled their eyes and said it's not about the Troubles. It's not. And I know so many people are like, but Stormont, and it's the play on words, and of course it is. That's down to you to decide what you think. Stereotypically, it seems to be more the English people that want to go with that line of argument. This is a metaphor for the Troubles. Heaney was not a particularly political poet. He wrote a lot about nature, so it makes sense that it's about nature. But a good piece of advice from a teacher that I once worked with, she used to say to her students, just give a nod to the context. So go with the language, go with the structure, but just a little nod where you say, okay, well, do you know what? The storm could be a metaphor for the troubles, and you can call it the troubles. The examiner will know what you mean, that were going on in Belfast and in Northern Ireland, and to an extent it continued to go on. So it's about nature, but it could also be a reference, and you could say, semantic sort of war, the war imagery could suggest, and as long as you're using that tentative language, I think that you're sort of safe and good to go there. Definitely Glovebox has more or less just echoed exactly, or I've echoed what Glovebox has said there. Really good. The earth is wiser than they are. Absolutely. At the beginning, is there an irony in that? We are prepared. He talks about how prepared they are, but then as the poem goes on, you get that sense of fear, don't you? And that sense of bombardment. So it's this idea, can we ever be fully prepared for nature? Is that kind of a certain arrogance that they feel prepared for it, but ultimately they're still scared. So yeah, got some year 8s tuning in a few years too early. It's all good. Now, if you were to look at the Mr. Bruff video on Storm on the Island, I hate to admit I was outdone by Mr. Bruff. He come up with something that I hadn't thought of before. Credit where it's due. He comments that what you'll find in Storm on the Island is some examples of Abe kind of is there as I'm talking about it. Abe's beat me to it almost. Casual language, absolutely, David. So the casual language that he uses reflect the idea, absolutely, you're right, that the people are used to it. So it's this idea that even though nature is really powerful, it's the idea that actually living there, it just becomes part of everyday life. One example of that is when he says the phrase, you know what I mean. You know what I mean. When it blows full blast. Not if, when. When it blows full blast, you know what I mean. And the casual tone there, again tentative, could be argued to reflect kind of a casual approach to it, even though it bombards them, even though it's explosive, even though they fear it, it's this idea that they're kind of used to it, if that makes sense. So yeah, absolutely, you know what I mean. So that casual aspect to it. We also see that, I'll bring up poems as we're doing this, because obviously we need to learn all of them. I wouldn't compare this to Remains. I think this is definitely a nature poem. This and the Prelude go perfectly. There's a lot to be said for exposure, which we'll go into in a bit more detail tomorrow. But the connection I'm making is that you see that in Remains, where he's going on another occasion, legs it, mates, tossed his guts, carted off. Again, you get that casual language. Now, in Storm on the Island, it's kind of a casual approach to nature's power and the storms, whereas in Remains, it's that casual approach to death and violence when you're at war. But actually, it's when you're at home that the trauma kicks in, and when you're at home that casualness fades. So we will definitely do Remains later in the week. We'll get a post up letting you know the schedule as to what we're doing on what evening as well. So David has said, space is a salvo, could show the volatility. of nature. Absolutely. You know, remember, space is everywhere. So it's this idea of maybe nowhere is safe, that where there is space, which is everywhere, you know, space is a salvo, it's explosive. Nature can explode at any moment. Now, Tahini, that's a storm. It's the wind, it's the ocean spitting against your windows like a cat, you know, like a tame cat turns savage. That's what can change at any moment. Whereas actually in the Prelude, and this is exactly how I'd expect you to write it in an exam, show that you know the difference. You know, in Heaney's world, it's the volatility of nature. It's the fact that a storm can come out of nowhere. I'm enjoying doing the cat thing. But whereas in the Prelude, it's to do with perhaps nature taking from you. There's no storm in Extract from the Prelude, but it's this idea of the darkening forces of nature. Now, whether that is reflective of his sexual awakening as a teenage boy, the idea of these sexual feelings, you know, being a huge peak. I mean, I'm not going to get too explicit with it, but, you know, a peak, maybe a sexual peak, that's his first experience of that type. And it's black, it's dark, it comes with a darkness. He says it upreared its head. It's like it takes on a character of its own, and maybe those feelings to a boy with no one to guide him, no parents to speak of, who's been orphaned, it's too much for him to deal with. And again, possibly could link to the idea that these dark forces of nature have taken his mum from him, taken his dad from him, that we're not talking a storm, but we're talking that the natural world, the universe, nature itself has the power to completely turn your life upside down, to take your parents and those you love from you, and to kind of leave you to fend for yourself, you know, out on that, perhaps that metaphorical lake, that lake of life, you know. I struck and struck again. It's that panic. What do I do? Where do I go? And by the end of it, I'm going back to the covert of the willow tree. I'm trying to go back to safety. I'm running home. But it's a trouble to my dreams. So there's lots to think about there. Just skimming through the comments. So Dicko's saying that she definitely, what's that, Dicko? Storm on the Island? Yeah, Storm on the Island and Exposure. Interesting. Space is nothing, but in this storm, air is dangerous. We've got Molly's joined. Yeah. So Dicko's saying in both Storm on the Island and Exposure, they are exposed to the violence of nature. Nature overpowers them and has the power to kill. Yeah, absolutely. Storms come from nowhere. And it's interesting that, because we said about doing Exposure tomorrow, but you know, it's perfect to talk about it now. The power of nature, a storm comes from nowhere. Now it's funny because in Wilfred Owen's poem, they've gone there to fight the enemy. They've gone to the front lines. Remember, he was a soldier. They've gone there to fight in a war. Now, in terms of war, nothing's happening, but nothing happens. You know, sentries a soldier. Sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Nothing's happening, but nature is happening. So that the power of nature there, the immense cold and the wind and the snowflakes have come out of nowhere. It's caught them off guard. And actually a beautiful way that Owen describes that is he talks about the snowflakes. I love doing this. I go up to students in class, listen to the quote, pale flakes, snowflakes, with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces, okay? It's the idea, he personifies the snowflakes, that they come feeling for your face. So the irony that they're fighting each other, well, they're there to fight the enemy, aren't they? And essentially they end up in a battle against nature and they can't win. And at the end of that poem there, you've got the all their eyes are ice. So again, on a literal level, that's dead bodies on the ground. The nature's won. Nature's frozen them to death. He gives this image. If I pucker my forehead, it looks like that. Yeah, it doesn't look nice, but that's what I'm doing. So he says that actually nature has puckered their foreheads crisp. Yeah, they're frozen. Their eyes are frozen. But again, if you're looking at Exposure in terms of war, the effects of war on soldiers, that's a whole different question. It's the idea that maybe their eyes are ice because they're numb and that propaganda is no longer strong. So we'll look at it tomorrow as a war poem, but certainly looking at it as a power of nature poem. Definitely any of those three go beautifully together. So the soldiers whisper, curious and nervous. Yes, Tyler, the semantic full of confusion. They seem to be at war, but nothing happens. Yeah, absolutely. So the thing that I really will push here is that exposure can be used as a poem to look at the effects of war on soldiers psychologically, but also to look at the power of nature. And it really does depend on the exam question as to which other poems you compare it to, because it goes beautifully with Remains, with Bayonet Charge, even possibly Charge of the Light Brigade. But again, if it's the power of nature, you've got different parts of it that you're going to talk about. And it goes really nicely with Prelude and Storm on the Island as well. So yeah, absolutely. So really good one there. So we've talked about the snowflakes. I love that quote. Remember it, the word stealth, I'm sure if you play computer games where you have to be stealthy, if you're stealthy, you're like an assassin. You creep up on people, stealthy, bam, and you get them. And that's how he describes the snowflakes, that they're stealthy. And when he says they come feeling for our faces, remember we said Ozymandias's face, a shattered face, a shattered visage in the ground. Your face is very personal. So when he gives that image of the snowflakes feeling for their faces, from Owen's perspective, it feels personal. It feels like nature's out to get them, Nature's feeling for their faces. Nature is the enemy and it's outwitting them. So not only is it stealthy, but it's aggressive. And the opening shows you that, our brains ache. They're in pain because the wind is merciless and it's kniving them. So it's like knives stabbing them. I mean, how much more personal can you get than that? So absolutely personifying the snowflakes, personifying the wind, and really giving nature its own perspective and its own sense of aggression. And we see that in the Prelude, don't we, with the idea of it upreared its head, the darkness of nature. Nature's taking on a force and a mind of its own. So what have we got? Joe Trevor in the house. Okie dokie. So feel free to get your questions in there. So we've practically looked at sort of 3 poems now, haven't we? So Prelude, Storm on the Island, and Exposure as nature poems. So I sent out a video earlier and it's looking at Pigeon English, but there are some good tips in there just generically that Dicko's put together just in terms of opening an essay and a piece of writing. So again, there's no one correct way to do this, but you might decide to open a poetry comparison with both poets present the idea. So you could say in Storm on the Island and Prelude, both poets present the idea that nature is powerful and can turn at any moment. And then what you've got to make sure that you do is really explore each of those poems in detail individually. You're not just saying how they're similar or how they're different, but you're going really in depth about one. The simile, spits like a tame cat turned savage. The ocean is spitting against the windows. People are kind of in their homes and that's a scary image. Nature can turn. The juxtaposition of tame and savage show us that volatility. The space is a salvo, explosive, that volatility, the idea of it changing at any moment. And Wordsworth does the same, not through a simile, not necessarily through a juxtaposition, you could argue it's that, but through that kind of change in tone from sparkling, bright, glittering moonlight to darkness, a huge, dark, black mountain uprearing its head. So yep, Friday night on an English stream. People that are going to smash their GCSE. So next Friday they can put their feet up, go out for the evening, chill and watch a bit of Netflix, do whatever they want because they'll know they have smashed, absolutely smashed paper 2. So, any more questions on the nature of poems? Just trying to think if I've forgotten anything. I like this note at the end of the prelude. You've got there hung a darkness. There hung a darkness. So that's interesting. So it opens with, a summer evening, small circles glittering by the moon, glittering moonlight. And at the end, there hung a darkness. It's this image of darkness. No familiar shapes remained. It's like that night on the lake. And please do a search for the Akala video, Poetry Between the Lines. He does an amazing video on this. It's filmed in the Lake District, and he talks about, that night on the lake, something changed in Wordsworth's mind. No familiar shapes remained. It's this idea that his world has been kind of turned upside down. Is that the night that he realised that, wow, nature can just turn and completely change my life and take my life in a heartbeat? Is it that it is a kind of sexual awakening, and is it the idea that everything that was familiar to him is no longer? Remember that he was in his early teens at this point. That is a time, as you will know, of immense change. Sometimes your world can feel like it's completely changing and shifting, and you need guidance and you need support through that, and he doesn't have it. So there's no familiarity in his world at all. And, all he's got is nature, and nature can feel quite scary and can feel quite dark. Joe's asked, is there prophetic fallacy in Storm on the Island? Do you know what? Prophetic fallacy is where a writer makes up weather, uses the weather or the physical environment, usually weather, to create a certain mood. So I'd say if he was using a stormy setting as a metaphor for something else, you could call it pathetic fallacy. Definitely you could. But I think if it's not symbolic and it's a real life storm, then he's actually telling us about a real storm that's happening. So it wouldn't necessarily be pathetic fallacy there. But you certainly, Joe, would not lose any marks because you'd be using subject terminology, and that's a really good thing to do. Okay. Yeah. I feel like I might get carried away with analysing. Lose focus on the question. A good thing to do with that, I know Glovebox has given you some good advice there, Molly. A student I taught last year, what he used to do at the end of each paragraph, and it's a great thing to do, petal, point, evidence, technique, analyse, link, peel, just link back. Just make sure at the end of every paragraph you're writing that you link back to the question, that you use kind of the wording of the question, or just whack it in there every now and again. So, and you can't get carried away with analysing. You could get carried away with retelling a story, and that would be very bad. But as long as you're analysing, do get carried away to an extent. You want that detailed analysis, that really thoughtful, in-depth analysis. So I wouldn't worry too much, but if you've got the power of nature, just keep linking it back. Beginning of the paragraph, end of the paragraph, this demonstrates that nature can be such and such, such and such. If the question's the effects of war, this shows that the effects of war can be really negative and can be traumatic and can be long-term, like in Remains, where you've got him, blink, sleep, dream, and he's reliving the experiences that he's been through. Absolutely no problem, Joe Trevor. Okay, so I'm just having a quick flick through to make sure I've not missed anything obvious. Really, really obvious there. Huge and mighty forms at the end of Prelude. I think Dicko said something there about Ozymandias. I mean, that's a good point. A lot of people like to talk about Ozymandias as a nature poem as well. So again, it's this idea that no matter how powerful and mighty we think we are, ultimately, even if it takes a couple thousand years, nature will win, and nature will bring down people who feel that they're above the natural order. So it's this idea of the semantic field of nothingness. At the end of Ozymandias, you've got bare, decay, nothing beside remains. It's this idea that nature has gradually, it's taken time, but nature has worn down this colossal statue, this symbol of power. I even read a response from last year where a student talked about the power of nature in tissue. She got a really high mark. Didn't say that much, really, just said that in terms of the light imagery there, let the daylight break through the capitals and monoliths, that we as humans build these big monolithic structures. We build capital cities and we think we're all powerful with our law courts and our parliament and government, but actually the sun, that's a natural thing, that's nature, shines, breaks through, the daylight breaks through that, the sun shines through the borders. I can say, this is this country and that's that country. All of that is human made. It's man made. It's us trying to make our mark on the world through the kind of, train tracks and things like that. But again, it's that idea that nature, sun, light will win in the end. Okay, it's interesting. Liam, you're saying that gods are stronger than nature. When you look at the Greeks and the Romans, they believe that gods are nature. There's no discrimination there. The gods are almost like a personification of nature. So if there was a storm at sea, the Greeks would quite literally believe that Poseidon was angry with them. If there was a storm and there was thunder and lightning, Zeus is the god of the thunderbolt. So they would believe that actually the gods sort of controlled nature or were nature and were one with nature. What the poets are showing us in this anthology of power and conflict is that actually people who think, as Glovebox has said there, people who think they're above nature, that's where nature will bring them down. You've got My Last Duchess, Neptune taming a seahorse. It's that immense arrogance. And what Browning as a poet is doing there, probably, possibly, arguably, is condemning that and showing us, the idea, the concept that those in power really do believe they're above everybody else, and those in power can quite literally get away with murder, because that was the word on the street, that he'd kind of had his wife killed. Again, like Miss Glover just said, with Ozymandias, he built this massive statue in his honour. He went on as though he was a god, king of kings, I'm Ozymandias, look at me. But ultimately nature has brought him down. Okay, I think Liam's getting a bit carried away with like battles between the gods and things like that. That's a lovely thing to think about, and it's a lovely thing to research. But I'm not sure going that direction is really going to help us with the poems that we're studying. So Joe's asked, does Ozymandias have power? Ramesses II was an Egyptian king. He was the greatest, the longest reigning Egyptian king, also known as Ozymandias. So at the time he lived, yes, he had power. The hand that mocked and the heart that fed. He mocked people, he sneered at people, he ruled the country of Egypt with an iron fist. He was a fierce ruler. So yes, he had power. Now, at the time Shelley wrote that poem, they had found actually a statue, a massive statue that had since fallen of Ramesses, of Ozymandias, and that statue was being shipped on a ship to England, and it's still here. It's in a museum in London. So Shelley kind of got wind of that, and he was inspired by that to write the poem. That's the poet Shelley. Now, he was known for being really quite anti-power. He didn't like traditional forms of power. So he was inspired by the discovery of that statue, and decided to write this poem. And instead of showing us an image of Ramesses ruling and being powerful, instead he gives us the image of this fallen statue, this idea that this man thought he was all that and a bag of chips. He had this massive statues built up, look at me, but the irony being no one's looking at him anymore. I met a traveller, that's how it starts. I met a traveller from an antique lounge. Someone's just stumbled upon it and someone's seen it, but no one really cares. So it's almost showing us, you might think you're powerful, but in the scheme of things, you're just a man. And that, hopefully that answers your question. So he was powerful, but I think the poet is making him less powerful and trying to sort of someone in my class, the other Joe, suggested that maybe Shelley is stripping him of his power. Maybe Shelley's mocking him like he mocked others by calling him Ozymandias, because that wasn't actually his real name. That was the Greek variation of his name. So all good things to think about. I love the questions. I love the engagement, those of you that are engaging with it. And again, you know, you've got us in the department. You can come and chat to us anytime, write down anything that you're sort of not sure about, and we can chat it through with you. Yeah, absolutely. Stripping him of his power. He acted like, yeah, absolutely, I'd agree with that. He acted exactly like Macbeth was acting towards the end of the play, that kind of arrogance, that hubris. You know, we talked about that word. It's a Greek word, immense pride, hubris, and the gods punish you for it. You're brought down. So definitely we could say that there's a sense of hubris being shown, an immense pride by Ramesses II, and maybe not in his lifetime, but many years later, nature has brought down that structure, most definitely. Okie dokie. So feel free to fire away with any last questions. I think we've covered quite a lot there. I would definitely recommend that you, sit down at some point, do have a read over the poems. Mind map also. Mind maps are brilliant ways to revise. So you can have Storm on the Island. I'd literally draw rain. I'd draw an ocean, maybe a cat spitting, exposure, draw a snowflake. The flakes come feeling for our faces, the repetition of the F sound, the alliteration, feeling for our faces. It almost sounds like someone that's immensely cold. Even looking at the title of poems, a lot of people forget that. Exposure is exposure to the elements. These men are exposed, they're not being taken care of, but on a deeper level, it's exposure of the truth that actually, in spite of the propaganda, it's not honourable, it's not glorious, it's a really unpleasant experience. So Cunningham, you're not invisible. I can see you. I did offer an apology earlier that sometimes the questions get delayed. So if you've been asking questions and I haven't seen, I'm sorry. Please do feel free to retype and I promise I will answer you. Dicko, men think their power will last forever, ever, but Wordsworth realises that it's so much bigger and more powerful than he ever thought before. Yep, absolutely. You could say the government in Pigeon English are portrayed as they're oblivious to the troubles going on in society. Yes, we've done a lot on Pigeon English there today, haven't we? So, yeah, absolutely. Arrogant. Liam's mind is what, yeah, I mean, I think we get a bit confused, maybe we muddy the water if we start talking about Pigeon English in the midst of the poems. We can make little links to like Macbeth and different things, but I think that deserves its own sort of analysis, really. Okie doke. But that's good. It's good that you're thinking. It's really good that you're thinking about all the text, and that's a great thing to do. In Pigeon English, what does the image wave represent? Because I was talking with Mr. Brown. Okay, Dicko, I'm not sure about a wave. That doesn't stick out in my mind. But if you're thinking water, Joe, ocean, yeah? At one point in the novel, the pigeon... and if you look on the Instagram posts that we've got up, there's one a bit further down and it's got that. The pigeon says that we all think that we're an ocean, but really we're just one drop. So really that's a metaphor for the fact that as a society, all of us together are drops in an ocean. We're all part of the same body. We're all part of the same kind of body of water. And it's this idea that each of us is a drop. Each of us is a raindrop. And we all form an ocean. So it's the idea that we're all in it together and we should look out for each other. And at the end of the novel, when Harry's dying, he's looking at the rain and he says that he loves all the raindrops the same. And that, again, for a grade 5 here, that could be Kelman's way of saying that each of us should do that. Each of us could learn from Harry, from his death, to love each other, each and every raindrop, the same. And again, the government could learn from that as well, to actually give every child what they need, to intervene before it's too late, to help and support, rather than just being there when it's too late. And he also mentions that the raindrops were crashing into each other. So again, if we take that as a metaphor, that the raindrops are symbols of, all the children, all the people in the world, or in our society, our community. It's this idea that we're crashing into each other, we're fighting each other, we're not helping each other. And maybe Kelman wants us to acknowledge that, we're all kind of drops in the same ocean, and that we should help. So if you can even just talk about that in the exam for Pigeon English, Kelman uses the image through the pigeon and through Harry. Both of them give the same image of people being like drops of water in an ocean, and the idea that actually each drop is as important as the next, because we're all part of that one ocean. I hope that helps a little bit, Joe. Yeah, Murta's picked it up. Start at the roots of the problem. Again, when do we see police? The only time we see a policeman in that novel is at the beginning, when the boy's already dead. So it's that intervening when it's too late. The playground's on fire. We did this in my lesson today. And when we read the extract where the playground is burning, there's 4 different times in that short extract where Harry mentions that everyone was just watching. Everyone came to watch. 3 times he says everybody, and the 4th time he says all the grown-ups were just watching. So how prominent is that? It's the idea that, you've got this, it's only when things like that happen that everybody comes together, but still no one's doing anything. Everyone's just watching. We need to take action. We're all part of the ocean. We're all drops in that ocean. We're all in it together. And he mentions in there, Harry, that they all felt a bit closer together when the playground was dying. It's like only through these bad things happening do people come together. Well, why don't we come together for good things too, and to solve the problem? Absolutely. Start with the small problems. Exactly. When you've got kids throwing rocks at traffic, communicate with them. Again, Harrison said, no one tried to stop us. The playground was dying. No one tried to save it. Harry's being sexually molested in his own home. Mama's never here when we need her. And that's not a critique of Mama. We feel quite sorry for Mama. She's hard working. She's a midwife. She's working all the hours. But it's this idea that the village is no longer raising the child. We're kind of leaving these children to kind of fend for themselves in many ways, and not doing our job. Oh, that's lovely. So glove box there. Please do, make the most of us as your English teachers. Please do come and communicate. Absolutely. So Abe and Liam, you're absolutely right there. People only intervene when it's already too late. So that beautiful image of the sea there. Absolutely. Now again, if you're in an exam, don't worry about getting a word here and there wrong. If you've put it's fuck you, but it's really fuck off. Sorry about the language, but that's a direct quote from the novel. If you've put that the playground was burning, and nobody or no one, it doesn't matter, as long as you really get the meaning and your textual references are on point there. Absolutely. Cunningham, in London where it says palace walls and that, could that mean there are 2 sides of the wall? What a fantastic comment there from Cunningham. Absolutely, James. So the wall itself there, definitely I would say is an image, a metaphor used by William Blake to emphasize exactly what you said. Well done. The divide between rich and poor. And if we look at that quotation, that the sigh of the soldier runs in blood down palace walls. So on one side of the wall, there's blood, there's destruction, there's danger, there's suffering, but the rich are kind of cozy behind their palace walls and protected, and you get a wall image in the emigre as well. So once we look at that poem, we can talk about that a little bit more, but really good point there. The sea, the drops all make the ocean, which is the society, the community. So I'm guessing where people keep saying sea, that you're correcting me that it's sea and not ocean. But again, examiner's not going to mark you down for that. Like I said, I'm doing it sort of from memory here. So don't worry about those little references. But yeah, I'm really pleased that we're all sort of involved in looking at that as an image. Because yeah, a raindrop as each person. The raindrops at the end, Abbe, indeed crashing against each other. We're fighting each other when we should be loving and supporting each other. There's a really good Fire in the Booth from Akala, Fire in the Booth Part 1. And he says that. He's talking about, you go to the pub on Friday night and fight with someone you don't know what for. You won't fight with a guy in a suit and a tie that will send your kids to die in a war. It's this idea that we're a community. Maybe that's Kelman's way of pointing out that in Harry's community, stop crashing into each other. Fight against maybe the politicians, fight against those who are not helping, but try and show each other a bit more love than all this sort of juking and, the attack on Mr. Frimpong. Mr. Frimpong's one of the raindrops, essentially. We're all in this together. We all need to be a bit more human. Yeah, definitely. And Dicko's got there, all babies look the same. So again, much like with the poems where we say, look at the beginning, look at the end. It's the same with this. You could see the blood. It was darker than you thought. And there's that cyclical structure, because again, when Harry's passing away, again, you can see the blood. It was darker than you thought. So we open with the dead boy. We end with Harry being dead. That cycle. But that very last line, all babies look the same. We know that's not true. So we know that's a metaphor. Well, what does it mean? All babies look the same. Every little baby has the potential and deserves to be loved and treasured. They too are one of the raindrops that deserves that absolute love. It's a bit of a far-fetched maybe, but after Harry's stabbed, he says he saw the handle of the knife briefly. It might have been sort of green, it might have two different colours that he gives, green or brown, but again, it's this idea, no matter what our colour is, no matter where we come from, no matter our situation, we all deserve that sort of that love and that opportunity. Mark, could you say when he says all babies look the same, is Harry's vision going blurry as he's dying, which shows the innocence of him that his last thought was a child? I think you can argue whatever point that you want to argue there, Liam. I think a lot of it shows his innocence. I think more so what shows his innocence is he talks to the pigeon. He says, I like your feet. They're kind of scratchy. And are you a messenger of God type thing? So it's kind of his innocence is still with him. We're born the same and our circumstances change us. Absolutely, Myrta. Better late than never, Shanice. Nice to see you. All babies have the same start point. Absolutely. And capacity for good. And again, Harry's start point, coming to England, fresh start, a new life. But look at how his environment has ultimately led to his death at the end. It's really tragic, really sad. And it deals with issues, prejudice, class, etc. Okay. So that's Kelman saying that we have a choice. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we get that through the narrative of the pigeon. We get the pigeon saying, stand tall and you're bigger than those weeds. It's this idea that we do have choice. But I suppose what Kelman could be doing is showing us the difficulties, through the eyes of an 11-year-old. And it's really adorable at the end when he's dying. I mean, it's awful because he's dying in a puddle of someone else's, quote, piss. It's a barbaric image, completely inhumane. But it's this whole idea that he could have chosen, but what chance did he really have? And when he says I wasn't suspecting it, again, he's got that word wrong. So as a little boy is still trying to make sense of his world, his life is really tragically taken from him. So I'm just going to give you a heads up that I've got a minute remaining on here and it's going to cut me on out. So very quickly, you're your own person. Makita's the product of her environment, absolutely. So we've got this idea of her being abused. She's got those burn marks on her. She then goes to burn Lydia. So it's that abuse being cyclical, that she's a product of her environment. She's only doing what's been done to her. She understands love through violence. What a perceptive thing to say. I think what I'm going to do actually is just cut out of here so we've got an extra couple of minutes and come back on so that I'm not just completely leaving you in the lurch. I've got loads of comments there. So literally I'll be back in about 5 seconds.